Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Stephen Carter, Editorial Director of IGB, and I'll be chairing today's IGB webinar in association with ICE365 on building sustainable sports betting ecosystem. Sports betting regulation is moving rapidly across the US, but are consumer protections keeping up with the pace? To mark Problem Gambling Awareness Month, this session brings together some of the professionals looking to raise standards across the sports betting sector. Our experts today will share their key pain points, flag underlying issues, and outline best practice examples for enhancing responsible gambling safeguards. Among the questions up for discussion today will be, are state regulations providing sufficient safeguards for bettors? What are the market leaders doing to track and protect their customers? Can lessons from Europe be transferred across the pond? And have operators applied the same standards in Europe as they have to US state markets, Our panel today consists of Martin Licker, who's Senior Vice President of US Regulatory Affairs and Responsible Gambling for Entain, Keith White, who's Executive Director of the National Council on Problem Gambling, and Seth Polanski, who's VP Corporate Social Responsibility and Communications for Conscious Gaming. I'll let them introduce themselves more fully shortly. Before that, I'm just going to let you know there'll be a Q&A session following the presentation, so please do submit questions as we go along. We'll try to address as many of them as possible in the allocated time. Okay, I'm just going to go to our panelists now. They're going to give you a quick introduction. Let's start with Keith.
Oh, hey, thanks, Stephen. And thanks for having us on this important webinar. As Stephen said, I'm Keith White. I'm Executive Director of the National Council on Problem Gambling. It's, we believe, the world's oldest advocacy organization to assist problem gamblers and their families. We are neutral on legalized gambling, and we work with stakeholders all across this space, including folks like Seth and Martin. So happy to be here and share our perspective on building a sustainable sports betting ecosystem.
Thanks, Keith. Seth?
Well, thank you. Pleasure to be here as well. I work for a new outfit called Conscious Gaming. We started in September, and our goal is to bring technology to the industry to help solve responsible gaming initiatives by protecting consumers in any way that we can. So like Keith, we work with all industry stakeholders in efforts to bring everyone together to tackle responsible gaming, particularly in the online gaming sector.
And finally, Martin.
Good morning, good afternoon, everybody, depending on which time zone you happen to be in. My name is Martin Lechka. I indeed look after regulatory affairs and responsible gambling in the Americas for Entain. Entain is one of the largest listed gambling businesses in the world. As you would know, in the United States, we have partnered up with MGM Resorts International to tackle the US market by our brilliant brand, BetMGM. I'm honored to be here today. I'm in a great company, not only because our organization and me personally have been working very closely with both Keith and Seth and their respective organizations.
Thank you, Martin. Okay, I want to kick off with quite an obvious question, really. Is the current trajectory sustainable? And if not, why isn't it sustainable? Who wants to take that one first?
I'll go just from strictly the responsible gambling perspective. Okay. I think it's very challenging to see that this trajectory will be sustainable. And one of the big problems is, of course, that we're rapidly building this sports betting ecosystem on top of a very, very rudimentary and in some cases non-existent problem gambling support system. So states and companies are now reaping what they've sown for the last 30, 40 years, which has been, in many cases, neglect or indifference towards having a problem gambling safety net. And this really creates challenges for everybody that's trying to do it the right way now with online and with sports betting. You know, if the state that you're working in has fundamentally refused to provide any public funding for problem gambling programs, as almost a quarter of states have not done, then I don't care what good responsible gambling you put on top of that, there's still no underlying fundamental safety net. You know, it's important for international folks to realize, you know, as Martin certainly does, that in the United States, healthcare is not a privilege, it's a right. And when you look at our response to the pandemic, when you look at our response to drug abuse and addiction, other public health diseases and disorders, you'll find that in the American system, government is often not the provider of last resort. In fact, government is often almost absent. And the burden really falls on NGOs like ours or on the private operators. So it creates a much different dynamic when you're talking about the sustainability of something like sports betting when there's a creaky foundation, a creaky public health foundation for problem gambling in general.
Thanks, Keith. Martin, do you want to take that one next from the perspective of Entain?
Of course, happy to do that. My view is, and it would not be dissimilar from Keith's, that the path to the long-term sustainability of any market, including the US market in this case, clearly goes through being responsible when it comes to responsible gambling itself, when it comes to other integrity issues, in particular in the field of sports integrity. So there is certainly work to be done. Of course, from an operator's perspective, operator that, as I've just said, is largely in the throes of entering the US space, we do see that the level of maturity of these markets is not yet as high as it is on the other side of the pond, but it's very clear that most of these markets, if not all, the new US markets are rapidly getting there. And indeed, the growth of the industry does need to be underpinned by solid protection, responsible gambling networks or foundations, if you will. Of course, and I'm sure that we will come on to that debate, it's, in my view, it would be foolish to believe that we could replicate what the industry has already put in place in Europe or just foisted on the US markets. I think that would be a big fallacy because all the applicable geographical and cultural idiosyncrasies need to be tossed into the mix. So I suppose what I'm trying to say is that we have embarked upon a regulatory journey in the United States when it comes to sports betting and internet gaming, and regulation is quickly catching up with the regulation that global operators such as Entain have been exposed to in other parts of the world. And you'd like to think, or I would suggest, that hand in hand with that, all the protection tools need to go hand in hand with that, and then catch up and live up to the standard to make sure that, going back to my initial point, in the long run, these markets are sustainable. In my view, the only way of achieving a sustainable market, or a sustainable market, is a market that is populated by customers that bet for entertainment, and it's also populated by operators that do not only provide for an opportunity to enjoy oneself, but also take care of those who unfortunately might be slipping down the slope of gambling addiction.
Yeah, I mean, I'll just add, I think they both said it well, but the goal for all industry stakeholders should be to build a sustainable ecosystem, right? It's the only way to succeed long-term on your own terms. So we're not there currently in the US, especially in terms of sports betting, but we are very early in the game. It does take tremendous resources to launch a new state. And with so many openings here, it becomes tunnel vision when grabbing market share is the focus, right? So we're trying to convince the industry that they're best served by getting ahead of the responsible gaming issues. There are clearly challenges with state-by-state model in the US, which must be overcome. But we would like to see operators doing a better job of going down parallel paths, putting as much effort into corporate social responsibility and responsible gaming as they do building out their business.
No, I mean, Seth is absolutely right, and I think that's been our journey for 50 years. And I think it's such an indictment of the lack of corporate social responsibility generally in the industry that, you know, the easy part is working with companies like Entain and Conscious. The hard part is working with some of our legacy land-based operators who, in the 50 years the National Council's been around, there are still a number of major operators in the United States who don't have a director of responsible gambling, who literally still multi-billion-dollar corporations that don't have a single person in their entire corporate structure who is actually dedicated to responsible gambling. I mean, just full stop right there. Trying to change the culture of this company that now wants to jump in the online and the sports space, or in some cases has already been in the sports space for 30, 40, 50 years. It's a massive shift. And I do agree with Seth and Martin. We're getting there. I do think expansion of sports betting is changing that dynamic. It's opening people's eyes. They're understanding that the old way of doing business needs to change, but they would have been so much better off had they done so a decade before. You know, had they been prepared for this expansion, and they're certainly going to monopolize it, and we're going to have to go back and sort of unwind, unfortunately, some of the damage. But you know, we'll get there. It's a little bit frustrating at the moment, I have to say.
Okay, thanks, Keith. I mean, you guys were touching on it there. I mean, you know, they're just saying what you're talking about there is, you know, the states that's problem gambling provision isn't where it should be. Martin said obviously it needs to be, everything needs to be underpinned with that, with those protections for players. And also, you're saying here as well, Seth says the industry's got to get ahead of the game. I mean, so how can the industry, given what these points you've raised here, can the industry avoid following trajectory over in Europe, where obviously you've got this perception of marketing being out of control, the sort of swung political and public opinion against the sector, as a result of these sort of regulatory clampdowns? Is there a way? Can the industry avoid that now in the States, or do you think that's inevitable that it's going to follow the same trajectory as it has over in Europe?
If I may, I would argue that it is, at this stage, it is inevitable. It's not inevitable that the industry would end up going down that route. Indeed, it would come down to committing to the basic principles that underline all these efforts. And I suppose and that may be, or that, in my view, that is one of the usual misperceptions, that doing business or doing good business is mutually exclusive with doing good responsible gambling, if you will. And I would suggest that that's yet another fallacy. As we talked about the sustainability, times are also changing, because I represent a gambling business, and we do need to make sure that we cater to the needs of our customers. And it's very clear, even regardless of geography, might be talking the UK, Europe, definitely the United States, the customers' needs and demands, crucially and critically, are evolving. To Keith's point, 30, 40, 50 years ago, don't get me wrong, I wouldn't be defending anybody. I wasn't even born 50 years ago, so I'm probably not in a very good position to comment on that. But I would suggest that customer demands at that point would have been very, very different from what they are today, in particular when it comes to the upcoming customer segments. Because our customers, arguably our customers who are between the age of 21 and 30 and who may want to choose to try their hand with sports betting or internet gaming, they would have a completely different view. And it's very clear that they are much more minded than it would have been the case in the past to spend their money, and that goes beyond gambling, needless to say, but they're much more minded to spend their money on whatever that may be with companies that have a very strong ethos, very robust CSR policies that do genuinely give back to be it their communities or other stakeholders. So a long story short, as I've already said, I truly believe that doing good business, good sustainable business, is not mutually exclusive with doing good responsible gambling. The two can be very easily married together and would ultimately cater to consumers or modern consumer demand.
I would add, I think it's important to point out that Entain and Martin deserve a lot of credit for what their organization is doing. They've really stepped up their efforts and are really leading this industry in change, and they're a great operator to look to for some of the programs that can be put in place. But you know, I recognize it's a competitive business, right? Often led by leaders with a sports background. We're very competitive and have a win at all costs mindset. But leaders need to have heart and compassion too. They need to put the public before profits. That'll be critical in the US, particularly the younger generation, as Martin alluded to, is very critical of corporations who are not being good citizens. So it will require leadership and a willingness not to follow the status quo or what was done before. And I think there really is an easy fix here. It's start to tie executive compensation, at least in part, to corporate social responsibility initiatives. If the proper incentives are put in place by company boards and CEOs, it's clear that the tools are there to effectively tackle the issues.
Yep, and Seth's right, absolutely. You know, and most U.S. gambling companies don't have a CSR plan, or at least a plan around responsible gambling that anybody can point to. So yeah, work to be done. Would it have been done, you know, a while back? But we'll get to it now. So it's an interesting. I do think there's a lot changing in the industry, and I think there's been a great infusion of companies like Entain, Kindred, others who have perhaps a different way of approaching, partly because they've been scarred by that backlash in the United States. And I'll say too, some of the things that our leagues, for example, our sports leagues have been the most resistant to shirt sponsorships or advertising within the stadium. And there's got to be a balanced approach to starting to allow gambling companies to have shirt sponsorships and in stadium advertising, team and league partnerships without without going too far. And I'm not sure where that middle ground is, but it's a fascinating discussion because that is Stephen, to your point, that was one of the issues in the UK that was one of the most controversial, right? Advertising, especially in play, and then league and club, the sponsorships of gambling companies. Those are two things that our industry has sort of been artificially prohibited from doing, and they're now really leaning into it. Sports Business Journal had this great article in a Detroit Pistons game just last week. 14 gambling ads were served up on a broadcast network during the course of that game. Is that too much? I don't know. But for American consumers who've never, ever seen a gambling ad during a broadcast, to within the space of 1 year, to have 14 of them during a single game, that feels like a lot. I don't know what the equilibrium is, or when or where the backlash is coming, but I think those are exactly the sorts of areas where we would expect maybe there to be some pushback.
If I may briefly react to that, and I don't think that this panel will be too controversial because I'm afraid, I'm sorry to the audience, we'll probably be largely agreeing with one another. But indeed, to my mind, the key point is to strike the balance. I think it's been proven in many other industries, but most prominently in the gambling industry, that bans are simply inefficient. They do not work, including advertising bans, because then it's very difficult to differentiate between legitimate license operators and other operators that are just shamelessly taking advantage of customers. Advertising can also be used for conveying responsible gambling related messages. So advertising has a massive role to play in my view, but indeed it does need to be done within reason. And I'm not sure I would want to, or I would dare go down the route of defining how many adverts per game there are meant to be. But as the UK example has clearly demonstrated, indeed, if the whole full-time break is merely populated by gambling related ads, then that unfortunately may, as it has, lead to quite some backlash from the concerned members of the public that would ultimately be writing to their MPs, or to use the US equivalent, to their representatives. So that's where the balance needs to be found. It's I don't think either that there can be a one-size-fits-all solution. But I think if we all work together, the organizations represented on this webinar, the operators, and ultimately, and also crucially, the legislators, the regulators, and the consumers, then I'm sure we will find the right balance that will preserve the prerogative of this industry to advertise, but advertise in a sustainable and smart way.
Okay, thanks, Martin. I'm going to return to this, the state-by-state model and the sort of the role of state regulations. But I just want to stay on the European question for a moment, though. I mean, do you think European operators are sort of over in the market are sort of learning lessons from over the pond in a way around managing their image to ensure they're sort of better positioned to withstand any change in public perception? Do you think those learnings have been applied in the US market at all? Are you seeing any of that, Martin?
From my perspective, it is meant to be, and it largely has been, a two-way traffic. So from Entain's perspective, we would of course tackle each and every market on its own merits. As I've already said, we would try in our product offering that of course extends to our responsible gambling tools. We would have a strong tendency to reflect any applicable idiosyncrasies. Yes, I reckon the whole European industry, including Entain in its previous disguise as GVC, has learned a lot of valuable lessons from the markets that we have served in the past and we continue serving. So in particular, the markets in Europe. And as a result, we would follow a set of best practices that we have identified as being efficient, both, as I keep saying, from the business but also sustainability perspective. But at the same time, and we are still largely, I suppose everybody is still a newcomer to the legalized US betting market, brushing the likes of Nevada, with all due respect, aside. So we continue our learning process. It's been quite a steep curve, in particular in the United States, with all those individual states that have or are in the throes of regulating. So that's what I, in a nutshell, would mean by a two-way traffic, because I'm hopeful, perhaps naively, but still hopeful, that if we can get it right in the United States, and as all the panelists seem to have agreed, we are getting there, not necessarily there yet, then there will be valuable lessons to be drawn and applied on the other side of the pond in Europe. So what's not to say that in a few years from now, once even more US markets have matured, that the European markets that have regulated online gambling and sports betting will not start learning lessons from the US markets. And that, to my mind, from the perspective of a regulatory affairs guy, that is an ideal outcome. You know, something is bound to have gone well, something is bound to have gone wrong, and then we can compare the notes across the pond.
Okay, thanks, Ryan. So I want to go on the state level, kind of the state-by-state model. I mean, Keith mentioned it earlier that, you know, there's some states haven't mandated problem gambling funding provision as well, which is one side of it. But overall, I just want to get the panelists' perspectives, you know, on the state regulations. Are they providing sufficient safeguards for bettors as they currently stand? Can I just, do you want to start with that, Seth, and then we'll go to Keith and Martin on that one?
Sure, I'll just really simply tackle it. I'm sure Keith has some good insight here. It's a mixed bag, right? Clearly, some states are better than others, and there definitely needs to be more funding going towards problem gambling across the board. And as Keith has championed for a long time, it would help if there was some federal funding to go against this. But to balance that, I understand it's tricky, right? Because you need to understand there's been a big black market operating in the US for such a long time that you must make sure whatever rules you put in place for the regulated market, they are enough to get people to switch into that regulated market, because there's no way to protect consumers in a black market with offshore operators outside of US jurisdiction. So I think the regulators are trying to strike the right balance. Some are doing a better job than others, though.
I absolutely agree with Seth. And on the black market, the only thing I would add to that, though, is that at some point, you do have to draw a line in the sand and say this is regulation that we have to do to protect consumers, because theoretically you can never do less regulation than someone who's unregulated. You know, you can never pay less tax than someone who doesn't pay tax. And so what we see are several states who are effectively trying to compete with the black market, but they're trying to do it by continually undercutting the black market, and that never ends. That's a downward spiral. So it's just a note. We hear a lot about, you know, we need to keep regulations low and taxes low to compete with the black market, but at some level there has to be a line. And I know Seth, everyone agrees with that. No one's saying, you know, you should just stop taxing and stop regulating so that we can outcompete the black market. But that's sort of where the discussion goes in some states. But yeah, I mean, I think the other part of this is when you look at state regulation, the real danger is that as states compete with each other, you're going to have a jurisdiction, one of our 50 state jurisdictions, or one of the hundreds of tribal jurisdictions, or maybe a renegade lottery commission who oversees online gambling. You know, there's almost 1,000 different regulatory agencies in the U.S. Some of them is going to set a very low standard, and then the pressure is going to be on everybody else to say, well, state X or commission Y allows this, why can't I do it in this other jurisdiction? And we're seeing that pressure already. We saw that with cashless gaming. You know, cashless gaming, when Nevada dropped their regulations and allowed, you know, just unlimited debit transactions, credit cards right at the table. The pressure then within days, if not weeks, was on all the other jurisdictions. Well, look, we can do this in Nevada. Why can't we do it here in Pennsylvania, New Jersey? And so I do think when you look at the differential regulations by state, the problem is everybody dropping to the lowest common denominator rather than, as Martin and Seth have said, trying to raise everybody to the highest to a high level. And there's signs that companies like Entain are trying to keep the same regulations across any jurisdictions, often in excess of what a particular jurisdiction allows. And there's other companies that are and have always defaulted to the lowest common standard. They may do good employee training in one market, and in the market right next door, where they also operate casinos, if there's no employee training requirement, they simply just don't do it. And so it's going to be a tale of two halves, and we'll see, you know, whether the better angels win, the folks that are focused on, to the point of this panel, long-term sustainability, or people that are just in to make a quick buck, and then they'll figure out the responsible gaming part later.
Thanks, Keith. And Martin, what's your take on that in terms of the protections state regulations are providing at the moment for bettors? Are they sufficient?
From my perspective, indeed, there has been a certain level of regulatory competition amongst the states that have regulated or in the process of regulating. Having said that, I would actually suggest that one of the biggest advantages of the existing US regulations is that in most cases, the initial setup or market entry setup is quite acceptable. It's not out of kilter with the market reality, which has, in my view, the advantage that operators are incentivized to enter, and by implication, they are being brought into the regulatory fold. And that's not always, sadly, the case in Europe. But at the same time, and to give you my general or generic view on regulation, I wouldn't have, and I would suggest Entain wouldn't have either, any issues with strict but sensible regulation. As I've said, not out of step with the market reality. But going back to my previous point about the market entry, I think it's absolutely critical to bring the legitimate operators that do want to be licensed in from the word go. That's why irresponsible or unreasonable barriers to market entry would never work. Having said that, in return of the privilege to be allowed to service customers pursuant to a local license, because there's a set of obligations that all operators have to honor. So I would say it as a gradual process. Bring the operators that are willing to be licensed and regulated in, and then work with them on increasing the applicable responsible gambling and other probity integrity, including sports integrity standards, because that would be, if you will, the price to pay in return of being licensed in a new state, in a new jurisdiction. And if collectively everybody involved gets that right, the implication should be that the black market operators, at least most of their operations, are driven out, because the customers, going back to my other point, they wouldn't feel any need to take their business elsewhere, because they know that they can bet, gamble, if you will, with the legitimate license operators, both in a safe, but also entertaining and efficient way. So in other words, if the black market operators are in no position, by disrespecting the applicable rules, to come up with better offering than the licensed operators, I reckon ultimately that is the path to both sustainable but also regulatory or regulatorily efficient market.
Okay, thanks, Martin. Just to move on to look at technology next. I mean, what role is technology playing and is set to play in building a more sustainable sports betting ecosystem in the US? Seth, do you want to lead off on this one?
Sure. I mean, there's plenty of technology available, particularly in the online sector. Can sometimes be a challenging task in the land-based environment. Clearly, a digital footprint and the rules around registration to get an online account change it. Everyone knows their customer in the online space, so there's a lot of technology that can help out. So, like for conscious gaming, we're bringing PlayPause to market, which is our technology tool that automates exclusions. We can prevent self-excluded consumers from placing bets online, while at the same time blocking the betting of insiders like coaches and referees and players or league employees and even gaming industry or state regulator employees. So it's a sports integrity tool and self-exclusion tool all in one. And it eliminates bad data and errors commonly found and really streamlines operations for everyone. We're working with state regulators, gaming operators, sports leagues, consumers, all going into a same shared repository. We're breaking down the silos of state lines and state regulations. We've created a system because of technology that really is elegant and solves a lot of the challenges that have existed in the industry for a long time. And it's just an example that technology can do a lot of things well. And there's hundreds of other tools that exist across this spectrum that can meaningfully help the industry improve procedures.
Yeah, just to add to that, I mean, we're 100% pro technology, and I think it's amazing the opportunities we have, both just now with existing technology, things like PlayPause, which are knitting together, some standard responsible gaming programs, and then what we're learning about in the future in terms of usage of these tools. How can we nudge people to make safer decisions? How can we use these big data sets to better understand not just abnormal gambling or problematic gambling behavior, but recreational gambling behavior? When you can see the data set on set on 1 million recreational customers, what are the things that help keep them protective? And then that's going to help us spot perhaps some of these red flags and warning signs in problematic customers. We're never going to use technology to diagnose someone. I want to be very clear. No one's calling on the robot psychologist to be monitoring your betting accounts. But there's so much more we can do with existing tools in the online space, in the online sports betting space, and then using that technology to further understand how to be both efficient and effective with our interventions. You know, I don't want to waste a message on the 95% of customers who don't need it. You know, I want to use that technology to tailor it, target it towards people who are at risk, and help those people who are at risk figure out where they need to be, you know, where their pathway needs to go. And so it's really exciting. And again, conscious gaming has been the lead of this. You know, Entain's embracing these solutions. And Martin, I don't know if you want to talk about your advanced, method, the ARC thing that you're rolling out, but it's an exciting time, frankly, in responsible gambling. There's so much we don't know about player behavior that we're learning now that's going to enable us really to do this a lot better, especially in the online space.
Okay, Mike, do you want to talk a bit about how you're what sort of tech you're leveraging in the States at the moment, Martin, in this area?
Yes, indeed. Technology, as both Seth and Keith have already said, is absolutely critical, in my view, to the long-term success of all our businesses, in particular the online gambling business or the sector as a whole. We all, needless to say, generate a whole wealth of data that we've started gradually and progressively putting to even more efficient use, be it by means of predictive technology, designing algorithms that help us determine the appropriate point in time to intervene in the event that somebody unfortunately may start developing a gambling addiction issues. But I suppose the beauty of that is that the technology, of course, combined with human touch, because ultimately our customers, just like us, are people who also love to hear from the operators' customer service representatives, have a chat, and that may help in itself. But the other point I was going to make, when it comes to the intervention, I would suggest that the technology makes sure that the intervention does not end up being counterproductive, because there may be instances whereby the first blush we may be thinking, all right, there is something brewing here and there may be a problem, so of course we would reach out. But we do have a set of data that we can check that intervention against, and the technology might be able to tell us, look, there's no case to answer, there's no problem, do keep monitoring that account, but there's a perfectly logical explanation for this particular customer's behavior. And that, to my mind, is the other significant point. It mustn't be one size fits all, because the underlying criteria, there needs to be a generalized set, but then they do need to be applied to the individual customers on their own merits. And in doing that without technology, I think we would all go cuckoo, because with the number of customers that are out there, that's impossible. That's why I keep talking about a human touch that's required as well. But the technology, if properly deployed, makes this process even more efficient in terms of both intervention, but also monitoring customer behavior and being able to identify the real problems, to Keith's point about whatever the percentage is, whether it's 95, 97, 99% of our customers that enjoy themselves responsibly, and that small percentage of customers that are in need of help.
Thanks, Martin. I want to move on to next, sort of a key pillar of ESG and CSR initiatives for the land-based sector in the US is philanthropy, sort of giving back to the communities that it serves. I mean, has that been adopted by the online sector at all? Are we seeing the evidence of that?
So for my part, we do, but it's a tale of a few leaders and then a lot of followers. You know, so in some ways, companies like Entain are giving cover to a lot of other operators who are doing very, very little, who are doing the bare minimum. And as I said earlier, in a social welfare country like Canada or the UK, Australia, Europe, it's expected that government plays a really big role. In the United States, government really doesn't on problem gambling issues. The federal government, as Seth mentioned, spends not a dime of the almost $8 billion they collect in gambling taxes. Not a penny of that goes back to problem gambling programs. You know, many states still choose not to devote money, and if they do, it's far less than the 1% figure we recommend. So just in terms of the role, so it unfortunately or ironically places in the US system a much bigger burden on the operators themselves to do even things like basic healthcare, which I don't think anybody thinks is really the role of a gambling company. But if the state you operate in has refused to spend any money to help people with gambling problems, then perhaps the industry, who is raking in windfall profits in a lot of cases, they do become the provider of last resort, you know, often, you know, not directly, but through an NGO like us. So in some ways, our system requires more of operators. And I think that creates a tension because operators, for lots of reasons, you know, nobody wants, including us, operators to be really directly involved in these decisions around caring for addicted gamblers. But again, if the regulator, if your state legislator and regulators have chosen to just throw these people aside, someone's got to pick up the pieces, and often that does fall on the industry. So the role of philanthropy in this sector is really challenging. And you know, it's not just the National Council. Obviously, Conscious is an NGO as well, but it really places a much stronger reliance on those who are in some cases least equipped and able to afford to provide services. You know, for our national helpline works nationwide, including in states that have no funding. You know, for the entire state of Texas, we provide all problem gambling services. The entire state of Texas, which sold $4 billion worth of lottery tickets last year, made $2 billion, and doesn't put a single penny of that into helping any Texan who has any kind of gambling problem. So that burden, you know, falls completely on us. And there's, you know, that's the model that people have to realize in terms of, you know, is the casinos lobby to you know, we've seen a lot of discussions about commercial casinos going into Texas, and there's lobbyists here and lobbyists there. They're going to own that. They're going to come into that jurisdiction and talk about sports betting and online gambling in a place where there's simply zero concern for gambling problems. So are those companies going to step up and provide basic healthcare services to all Texans who have gambling problems? I don't think that's their job. It's not their responsibility, but it's going to become their obligation because someone has to do it. And it can't only be, you know, groups like the National Council on Conscious Gaming.
Seth?
I don't really have anything more to add than what Keith said. I would just say that this goes back to my point. I think we need to be on parallel paths here. If the industry wants to avoid outsiders coming in and dictating the rules of the road for them in the future, they need to shore up some initiatives in this space on their own and not let it get to that point. And it is, to Keith's point, very difficult at some times because it shouldn't be the entire industry playing all parts here. But when the government isn't doing enough on their end, that it does fall to those profiting off the business, unfortunately. And I think there's good intentions, but it's also very difficult to manage a business this way, particularly that's growing and launching very rapidly.
Thanks, Seth. Martin, yeah, I mean, taking this, going back to what you said earlier, I mean, it seems, I guess the point is that not all companies are set up for this yet. So that burden falling on companies in these states. What's your take on that as a maintained perspective?
Well, first of all, let me thank Keith for singing our praises. That's much appreciated, and we're truly privileged and honored to be able and allowed to work with the likes of the National Council and Conscious Gaming. We also have other partners in this space. I'd like to think very much like-minded partners, the likes of players associations of the major leagues. We, through our US Foundation, work with a number of US colleges, and there are others, companies such as Epic Risk Management and Kindbridge. And as I've already said, in my view, this is not just the right thing to do, but ultimately it, fingers crossed, will be to the benefit of the long-term sustainability of the market. Indeed, we all agree that there's still a lot of work left to be done, and we set off on this journey. It's a long journey, but the sooner we reach the point that collectively, and by collectively I do mean the industry, its regulators, the legislators, and ultimately the consumers and the wider public start working together towards that ultimate goal, which is sustainable sports betting and internet gaming market that caters for those in need while providing exciting experience on a daily basis to those who would like to engage with our products and services. So the sooner we do get together and start working towards that goal as a conglomerate, then the better in my view. And I'm glad to hear that the panelists believe that Entain, together with others such as indeed Kindred, few other companies have been leading the way, but all the other companies are most welcome to join us in that quest, because I reckon, I'm afraid that we would fail unless we manage to get ourselves aligned on the basics, on the foundations that then we will be able to go and build upon in this space.
I will just say, Stephen, I think conscious gaming, one of our mandates here is to really bring the industry together, right? So there's never been, when it's state by state and different rules and different people in the markets and out, one thing that's lacked in the US is sort of a industry-wide take and view. And we don't have to be competitive when it comes to responsible gaming or philanthropy or corporate social responsibility. We're all aligned in those efforts. So conscious gaming hopes here, we're going to start with this exclusion tool, but when we get everyone on board, we can really bring the industry together to discuss all the issues we face and figure out solutions ourselves to find the right roadmap going forward.
Okay, thanks, Seth. So what I want to come find a couple, it's obviously it's Problem Gambling Awareness Month in the US. Just coming to Keith, obviously your organisation is behind this. What sort of how you would be focusing your efforts this month to sort of ensure the best possible sort of exposure and outcomes from your initiatives?
Yeah, thanks, Stephen. Yes, it is. March is Problem Gambling Awareness Month. No surprise that when we created this 19 years ago, we chose March because of March Madness, and we wanted to help add to the conversation that for the vast majority of people, March Madness is the fun, the excitement, the buzzer beaters, and the long shots, and everything that's great about this tournament. But for the 6 million Americans with gambling problems, March Madness is literally a clinical description of white knuckling on the couch and trying to avoid advertising and trying to stay off the bet. Because gamblers often feel they're one bet away from winning everything back. And, the tournament might be a great time to not lose your house. But gamblers feel maybe that if they're $10,000 down, but they know sports betting really well, it's an investment. It's not even a gamble. This is the only way to get $10,000 tonight, so I can make my rent or make my mortgage payment or XXX tomorrow. So we created this. It is a grassroots campaign. We receive no federal funding for this. Through support of folks like Entain, we create a campaign, but it's a grassroots effort. And I think so. The two purposes are: one, to increase public awareness generally, and opportunities like this webinar are fantastic. So we really appreciate that. And two, to educate healthcare providers to screen their clients during at least one day, if not the whole month, and certainly year round, for signs of a gambling problem. But the thing that's really great about Problem Gambling Awareness Month from the responsible gambling side, from the partnership opportunities, is we don't go to the entire U.S. gambling industry and say, hey, it's Problem Gambling Awareness Month. We've been around for 50 years. The event's been around for 20. If you're a company that if you're a company that lives responsible gambling in your culture, it's Problem Gambling Awareness Month. And so we welcome those folks that embrace it, but I'm not going to go out and bang on someone's door and say, oh, by the way, hey, it's March. Are you going to do anything? So it's been fascinating to see the companies that have supported Problem Gambling Awareness Month and the companies that haven't. And I think because when it comes down to it, it's culture. You're either in this to be sustainable and responsible, or you're not. And I'm not saying that everybody who's tweeted about Problem Gambling Awareness Month means that they're super responsible, or that people that aren't. But I think if you're analyzing the status of the U.S. responsible gambling commitment, company by company, look and see who's doing something in March and look and see who's not. And that's going to tell you a lot.
That's good. I mean, of interest, I mean, have you seen more companies supporting than they were, say, last year or the year before? Was it about the same or?
About the same on the company side. Yeah, there's been more uptick with public, but yeah, the company side's about the same.
Okay. Right. I think I've come to the end of my questions now. Actually, I just want to thank all of you for giving it a time today. Seth, Keith, Martin, for today's discussion. I know it was a brilliant discussion. Thank you. We haven't got any questions from the audience, unfortunately, so I'm just going to draw things to a close now. I just want to say thanks again for your time today. I'm sure if the audience have any sort of follow-ups that could come to mind now or after the webinar is finished, just send them in, and we can definitely forward those on to the guys here. So all we've got time for today, so just thank you all again. Today's webinar is being recorded and we're available to listen to on demand shortly on igamingbusiness.com to rewatch and share with your colleagues. Otherwise, we'll see you very soon. Thanks again, guys.
Thank you
very much. Thanks, Stephen.